everyone, welcome back to another week, and this is lecture 6, and this week we're going to do or cover the second brain tour, and we're going to look at cranial nerves. So what are the cranial nerves? We spent last week talking about surface structures, anatomical directions, things to kind of get you used to looking at different brain structures. So what are the nerves? So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are attached to the ventral surface or the bottom of the brain. And cranial nerves will emerge from the brain and relay information to and from the brain and other parts of the body. And cranial nerves will send information to and from the neck, while spinal nerves will deal with regions that are below the neck. So while we don't necessarily have to think about spinal nerves right now, it's good to know that there's a difference between them. The only exception being is the vagus nerve, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And these nerves can be involved in sensation, movement, or both. And important to contrast is that they're called nerves because fibers that leave the brain or the spinal cord and will go out into the peripheral nervous system, while tracts are fibers that will stay within the brain, they do not leave, or spinal cord, which will make up the central nervous system. So nerve leaves brain, tract stays in brain, nerve peripheral nervous system, tract central nervous system. A good example of a nerve versus a tract is the optic tract versus the optic nerve. The optic tract will stay in the brain, in the central nerve, or within the central nervous system, while the optic nerve will transmit information outside of the brain. And I will identify this a little bit later. So this is the full list of 12 cranial nerves that you're going to need to know, and here is a diagram of the ventral surface. So we have the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal accessory, and hypoglossal nerves. This sounds like a lot, and it is, but there are many ways to, memorize these. I would use some, flashcards or the Quizlet or, Anki if you prefer, which is kind of like Quizlet. There are tons of ways to figure out effective techniques to study for this exam. So we saw the 12 cranial nerves, and we're going to get into them in a little bit more detail in just a second. But what do you need to know about them when you're identifying them for the test? So you're going to need to be able to name it, say whether it's a sensory, motor, or both nerve, what is its function, and where is it located. And this will be for cranial nerves 1 through 6 and 11, I believe. Yes, 11. So olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, and abducens will need to identify by location, and spinal accessory. But all the other ones, for all of these, you'll need to be able to, like if I pointed out, pinned number, cranial nerve 1, you'd say, okay, well, this is olfactory. It's a sensory nerve only, and it's related to the sense of smell. And then you would also say, okay, this is where it is. For all the other nerves that you will not be identifying by location, you will still need to give name, type, and then function. So I've been talking a lot about sensory versus motor, but what does that even mean? So we have sensory, motor, or some nerves are both. So sensory nerves are afferent, while motor are efferent. And sensory nerves, while they're afferent, means that they are accepted into the central nervous system. So they send information from somewhere else, from another part of your body, to the brain for processing. So this can be from your skin, your muscles, your eyes, ears. When you touch something, that information from the nerves in your skin are going to then send that all the way to your brain, that is a sensory afferent nerve. So what I would use to remember this is the A as in accepted into the central nervous system, or A as in accepted into the brain. Conversely, we have motor or efferent nerves. So efferent means exiting the central nervous system or the brain. So this is going to take information from the brain and then use it to execute a movement. So I have a mug of tea in front of me and I'm thinking, maybe I want to have a drink. So I'm going to send information from my motor cortex down through my spine, down my arm, and execute a movement to pick up my mug. This is using motor or efferent nerves. Now, some nerves can be sensory and motor, so they can have information that's going to come from somewhere else, go through the brain, and then come back out. And we're going to cover those in just 1 second. So the first nerve that we're going to cover is the olfactory nerve. And this is right here. So this is technically the location of the olfactory bulb, but the nerve itself is removed in the process of removing the dura mater. So this is the closest that we can get, and it would technically be in here. But for purposes of identification, this is just fine. So, as the olfactory name might suggest, this nerve is responsible for detecting the sensation of smell, and if you have damage to this nerve, then you can lose your ability to smell or it'll be distorted. This is a common or somewhat common symptom that has been reported with COVID illnesses, and it has been associated with issues in the olfactory bulb, the olfactory nerve. So this you definitely will need to know the location of. And just as another note, the olfactory bulb and nerve, let me just make this a little bit bigger, one moment. Sorry about that. The ratio or the size of our olfactory nerves is much different, between animals. Like ours is relatively small compared to the size of our brains, whereas like in mice or opossums, where smell is really important, theirs is going to be, much, much larger. Like mice have almost 3 times as many genes that are encoding for smell relative to humans. I mean, we're at 1.0 and they have 2.67. So that, that's almost 3 times as large. But we don't need to rely on our sense of smell as much as mice do. Our frontal lobes are much larger, and theirs are much, much smaller in comparison. This is just, when we're comparing, because we want to think about in research especially that a lot of mouse models do have distinct differences, and while they are quite similar, this is one of the places where mice are very, very different compared to humans. Like if we were studying differences in distortion of smell, you might have to, more strongly distort or damage a mouse's sense of smell, to get something that would be similar to a human's, and that can cause some issues in generalizability for a study, for example. So moving on to the next optic nerve, next cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve. This is also a sensory nerve only, and it detects your vision. So damage to this would essentially cause blindness. You wouldn't be able to send information from your eye to your brain. So without that pathway, there is no sight. We have to be able to process what we're seeing in order to actually know we're seeing something. And this is right by the optic chiasm. If you can see, kind of just moving, if we had left more of it, more of the chiasm in this picture, you would see kind of like that X shape from last week. And then moving to the oculomotor nerve, this is our first motor nerve. And it will control eye movements and pupil constriction. So if we have damage to the oculomotor nerve, then you might have double vision because it allows us to create one coherent image between our two eyes. As you can see in this diagram here, the oculomotor nerve, venerates, I'm going to butcher these pronunciations, so forgive me, but levator palpebrae superioris muscle. So essentially, many of the muscles that are responsible for controlling movements in the eye, and also the optic nerve is central here. Without the correct function of the oculomotor nerve, you wouldn't have correct coordination of all these muscles together. And on the ventral, or the diagram of the ventral brain, which is close to the this is kind of the oculomotor nerve is somewhat close to the cerebral peduncles as a good landmark. So moving to cranial nerve 5. Excuse me, 4. Oh my goodness, excuse me. So the fourth cranial nerve, also motor only, is the trochlear nerve. And this will control eye movements, specifically in the superior oblique muscle. And these muscles will allow the eyes to roll downward and up and outward, and will stop the eye from involuntarily rotating. So if you have damage to the trochlear nerve, then you might have trouble looking down because you won't be able to roll outward or downward. And as you can see, the superior oblique muscle is right up here, which is then innervated by the trochlear nerve. So as you can see, the oculomotor, which innervates many, many muscles to help coordinate movements in the eye. So it's responsible for a lot. The trochlear nerve is responsible for one, but this is it's very important to make sure that this muscle functions correctly. And the trochlear nerve can be a little bit hard to see because it is very teeny tiny, but it is kind of nestled between the pons and medulla. So that's how I would remember this. And just to know that technically all of these nerves would have a pairing on the other side, but it makes it a little bit harder to see. And when you're taking off the dura mater and the other meninges and getting to the ventral space, that can cause some damage, so some of them will not make it through the process. So technically this would also be here, but for purposes of identification, look for a nerve on one of these sides. And this is another identification of it. It's a little bit hard to see, so this is the medulla in the red pin. I know I'm going to use a red pen. But here is the black pin. It's right here. So it's a little bit hard to see, but this is where on both sides, technically, I don't know if I can't really see a pin over here, but this is where the trochlear nerve would be. So this is a good example. If we were doing this in person, this is what you would see during dissection or during a lab practical. So this is a really nice example of what we're looking at here. And now we're going to take a look at the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, which is our first sensory and motor nerve, which is responsible for chewing, sensation of touch and pain. And these are all related to the face. So for chewing, that's muscular, and then sensation of touch and pain in the face will be sensory. So it makes sense that the trigeminal nerve is responsible for both, because we want to make sure that we can coordinate. If we chew down on something that is not okay, might be dangerous for our teeth, or just experience a strange sensation, we can send that information and either send back information, don't chew, or continue to chew if you're eating food. So eating and activities related to, controlling the face muscles makes sense that it would need to be both. And you'll find the trigeminal muscle, this kind of a little bit of a thicker one, which makes sense as well, because we need to make sure that enough information can be sent to and from at a fast enough pace. And here is an image of the trigeminal nerve in the white pin. So if I make this just a touch bigger, so you can see these are pretty thick nerves, and relatively easy to identify by the pons, and also the trochlear nerve is also close by with right here. They're a little bit hard to see, but I think there's a little itty bitty right there. So just as an example of what we can see on the brain. Then moving on to the abducens nerve, or cranial nerve 6. This is a motor-only nerve, and its function is to control side-to-side eye movements, and damage here will also cause double vision, and will control the laterus rectus muscles, and the abducens nerve here will innervate it. And you can find the abducens nerve right here, right on, I think, right here. A little bit harder to identify since it's kind of pasted down on the pons, but if you have a pinning there, then you can be at least more certain that if you're looking for a cranial nerve, that's the abducens nerve. But something else of note, so we have the abducens nerve, we have the trochlear and oculomotor nerves, all motor related, but all related to innervation and control of eye muscles. So it goes to show just how important coordinating eye movements are. I mean, because the abducens and trochlear, I believe, yes, control a single muscle by itself. And, and that really does go to show how important these are. And damage to your abducens or damage to the trochlear can cause double vision. And then let's look at cranial nerve 8, which is the facial nerve, which is both sensory and motor. So it is responsible for controlling facial expressions and crying, which is a motor responsibility, and then controlling the salivary gland for taste and the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So the front 2/3 of the tongue. And damage here can be a loss of taste and inability to make certain facial expressions. So kind of like if you see like facial drooping, like with a stroke or things like that, kind of similar to that, to how that would look. And strokes can actually damage the facial nerve, which can is an indicator for one of the like main signs that you are indeed having a stroke. And you can find the facial nerve very close to the abducens nerve. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. I meant the trigeminal nerve. Abducens is over here. This is trigeminal. Excuse me. It's another smaller, thinner nerve. However, a good landmark for it would be, being able to identify that this is trigeminal, but also that it's very close to, the pons. And many cranial nerves will be identified from here because so many of them, are moving between the spinal cord and the brain. And on to cranial nerve 8, so the vestibulocochlear nerve. And this is a sensory nerve. There There we go. So this is a sensory only nerve, and it is responsible for hearing and sense of balance. So as the name may suggest, and a good way to remember this, cochlea, cochlear, vestibulocochlear nerve. And it is very, very close to the facial nerve because it's right in here. But straight from the pons, the vestibulocochlear nerve innervates the cochlea in the inner ear so that the vibrations and sounds that happen inside of the cochlea are interpreted by the brain in the primary auditory cortex and the inferior colliculus. And just as a note, that the cerebellum, which is critical for motor movements, and other areas will coordinate with the vestibular system for balance. So if you ever hear someone, like if you go like up in the mountains or up really low, you kind of feel like a popping sensation. The liquids inside your ear that are responsible for balance can get a little funky and get out of whack. Additionally, the vestibulocochlear nerve is coordinating, with your brain in the primary motor cortex and your cerebellum to make sure that you have smooth, consistent movement. So, like for a primary or common example for most people, that your coordination will break down when you're drunk because the the relationship or the communication between the cerebellum and the vestibular system totally breaks down. It's just not happening, and you start stumbling around, especially if you've been drinking a lot. And additionally, the vestibulocochlear nerve is important for not feeling dizzy when you're moving or nauseous, so that kind of like seasickness or that you can feel when you're on a boat or in low-lying areas. And then we have the 9th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, which is a sensory and motor nerve, and it is responsible for moving the mouth, throat, and tongue area, which is motor, and controlling the posterior third of the tongue, so the back third of the tongue. And problems here that can mean that you can have problems swallowing and tasting, but swallowing is a really major factor here. And you can see the glossopharyngeal nerve right here. A little tough to identify, but very, very strongly clustered near the pons. And finally, we've gotten to the vagus nerve, which is a very, very important nerve. And it is sensory and motor, and it is responsible for sensations in the neck and throat, involuntary muscles in the abdomen, so the stomach and heart muscles, sensing changes in the viscera, so like your blood vessels, etc. And vagus nerve activity is linked to autonomic nervous system responses. So if we consider Loewy's experiment, which you may have talked about in other courses, Otto Loewy used frog hearts to basically discover the neurotransmitters, and he initially called them vagus stuff, or vagus stuff. So it was known for maybe a little under 100 years that if you stimulate the vagus nerve, it will slow your heart down. So Loewy would place a beating frog's heart with an intact vagus nerve in a saline bath. The saline in the bath was then allowed to flow into a second bath containing another beating heart, but without a vagus nerve. So stimulating the vagus nerve in the first heart would then slow it down, which was expected. But after a latent period, the second heart would also slow down. So really the point here is that the vagus nerve is strongly tied to autonomic nervous system responses, not just central nervous system responses. This is what I was saying at the beginning of the lecture, that the vagus nerve kind of is an exception to the rule, and it is very, very important. So damage to the vagus nerve will cause pain in internal organs or irregularities in the parasympathetic nervous system. And you can see the vagus nerve. You can see it right here. And the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve because it wanders through the viscera, so it's connected to everything. As I was saying earlier, it controls a lot of autonomic responses in addition to the central nervous system. So the vagus nerve acts as a main kind of go-between between the viscera and the brain. And as you can see in this image here, it innervates the pharynx, both lungs, heart, stomach, liver, spleen, pancreas, kidney, small and large intestines. It is getting information and helping to control all of the organs within our body. Now we have the spinal accessory nerve. This is a motor-only nerve, and it controls muscles that move in the head and the neck. So muscles of the neck and shoulder for turning of the head, and if it's damaged, then you can have trouble turning your head from side to side. As you can see in this image, the spinal accessory nerve is here and innervates the the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the soft palate, the trapezius muscle, and some of the spinal roots. So without the spinal accessory nerve, turning your head 180 degrees or from left to right would be nearly impossible. And you can see pretty clearly, since it's down toward the bottom of the brainstem, the spinal accessory nerve. It's teeny tiny, but unlike nerves 5 through 11, it's easier to see because they're not as crammed near the pons as other nerves. And finally, we have gotten to cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve, which is a motor nerve. And the function is to control muscles of the tongue. And if you have damage to the hypoglossal nerve, then you'll have weakness of the tongue and movement on the contralateral or the same affected side as the damaged nerve. And right here is your hypoglossal nerve, again near the pons, and will innervate a big portion of the tongue. I mean, you can see all through here, all of the yellow portions as a hypoglossal nerve innervating different parts of the tongue. So if you have damage, let's say to the left portion of your hypoglossal nerve, then your tongue will then kind of lean toward the left side and have weakness in that direction. So we have finally made it to the end, and here are a couple of acronyms that are relatively famous for identifying the order of cranial nerves and their sensory versus motor function. So the first acronym is to remember the name and number, and it's OOO, to take a family vacation, go Vegas after hours. To represent olfactory, optic, ocular, motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, Vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus. Take out the spinal here, for A for after, spinal accessory, and then hypoglossal nerves. This I found very, very useful when I had to memorize these. And then for sensory versus motor, some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter most. And it's true, a big brain matters a little bit at least. Which then relates the olfactory, optic, our sensory, ocular, motor, trochlear, or motor. But most, I think the ones that can be the tricky ones are trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus, which are both sensory and motor. And some further mnemonics to remember. If you have the olfactory nerve, you have one nose, you smell things, olfactory. In the optic, you have two eyes to see things, optic nerve, abducens. You have 6 abs, which is the 6th nerve. So abducens, AB, abducts the eye. Gotta remember the function. So then we have vestibulocochlear. So 8, vestibulo, which is for balance, for the cochlea, like in the ear, balance and hearing. We have spinal accessory, 11. 11 kind of looks like a pair of arms and shoulders, which innervates the shoulder muscles for neck movements from left to right. So these are just found these on Wikipedia, and there are tons of other mnemonics that can be helpful to remember function, or just try making up some of your own if you saw or thought about something going through the lecture. So please, if you have any questions about any of the nerves, their function, any questions about any of this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or come to office hours, which are on Wednesdays from 10 to 11 a.m. Or by appointment if you can't make that time. So, please, I want to make sure that you're all as successful as possible on this exam. Take care, everyone, and I will see you in the next lecture. Hi, everyone. Just after the fact, the attendance phrase for this week will be cranial. So as in cranial nerves. All right, that's all. Sorry, I forgot to put it in there. So just for this week, cranial nerves is the passphrase. Take care, everyone. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Bye.